So let's get started though with our program tonight. We're super excited about it. Our speaker tonight is Matthew LoPresti, and he is chair of the Asian Studies program at Hawaii Pacific University, and he's been teaching philosophy since 1999. And he has been there at HPU since 2004. And he's teaches courses in religious studies as well as philosophy and other interdisciplinary aspects of the humanities. And he's currently developing a course on yoga philosophy. There you go, Leslie. He's a specialist in South Asian and comparative philosophy, as well as philosophy of religion. And his primary area of research has been developing a metaphysical basis for a genuine religious pluralism. And so that's really, I think, key to our topic for this evening, where he's going to be speaking from his newest book on religious pluralism. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew, and Matthew, you can take it away. You'll need to unmute yourself. And then, of course, after Matthew speaks, we will open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Thank you to the Process and Faith team. Thanks to Jared for having me. I'm zooming in from Hawaii, Honolulu. It's a cold 78 degrees here. My apologies to those in colder environments. I'm really stoked to have the chance to talk about this book that recently came out. I've been working on a version of it for well over 10, almost 15 years. And I got sidetracked from my academic career in politics. And one day I went to a conference and talked about my book, and a publisher happened to be listening and said, we want to publish it. So here we are. My book is entitled Religious Pluralism Toward a Comparative Metaphysics of Religion. And really, it's inspired from my lifetime of interest in other faiths. I was raised Catholic in Northern Ohio, Italian and Irish background, so we're culturally Catholic as well. And I talk about in the preface of my book, since I was a little boy, I had questions about how faiths make sense of other faiths and worldviews. And I have one distinct memory when I was in CCD, this the class they'd make you go to learn Catholic doctrine as an elementary school kid. And I kept asking the same question to the nun who was teaching. And it was about, well, how do you make sense of people who never heard about JC spending an eternal damnation? The general way they explained it, if they don't accept Jesus Christ, the Lord and Savior, then they're damned. And I thought that doesn't make any sense. But if it is true, why are we here right now? Why aren't we out there trying to save these people? And the answer that they had given was never really satisfactory to me. They ended up sending me to the priest several times to try to answer it. I think they thought I was trying to be a troublemaker. But here I am many years later. I've got a book on the subject. I think I finally arrived at an answer for myself. And I really arrive at it through the study of process theology. Though I was raised Catholic, I lost my faith through college when I started studying philosophy and philosophy of religion. Taking classes where proving and disproving the existence of God daily. It's enough to cause an anxiety attack for somebody of true faith. And when I discovered process theology and the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, and specifically the iteration of it through Hartshorne and John Cobb Jr. and David Ray Griffin, it allowed me to make sense of faith in God in a way that honored my intellectual curiosity and my commitment to philosophical reason that traditional theology just failed for me. So this is just kind of a background how I came to process theology. And one of the things that I really picked up on, and I realized this is what I want to work on, I wrote my dissertation on this too, was the idea that with process theology, you can make sense of other faiths, not just in a soft way where oh, we value ethics and morality and caring about each other, but in a deep metaphysical sense, that we can have a more complex and I think more contemporary, more accurate view of reality that accommodates a variety of what I call religious ultimates. So things like God, things like Tao, Brahman, śūnyatā, emptiness, things like that. And again, this is not my idea. This is Whitehead and Cobb, and what I've spent my time doing with this book is trying to formulate it in a way that can be made sense from a comparative philosophical perspective. And what I mean by that, so I was trained here in the University of in Hawaii, at the University of Hawaii. I came here because they specialize in East-West thought. So I studied Sanskrit, I studied the Buddhist tradition, I studied Hinduism, Confucianism, all of these. I was trained for my master's and everything in Western school. So what I think I bring that is unique to the conversation of religious pluralism is I'm from a comparative perspective, and I can say that actually can make sense for this tradition. This can make sense for that tradition in a more, I think, authentic and um, from an informed perspective. All right. So with this book, I really start to dig into how people talk about pluralism. And the way so many people have talked about this term, it's used so many different ways that it's lost meaning. And so I spend the first chapter of the book really policing this term and trying to get back to, I think, a sensible understanding of it. And I want to share on a screen share. I've got a few figures early on in the book. Give me a moment. And somebody tell me when it's visible. Hopefully that's there. I get a thumbs up if you do that. It's not the best graphic. It's a old scan technique here. And so what we have in figure 1.1 and 1.2 is David Ray Griffin in his book Deep Religious Pluralism that he edited with I think John Cobb. They start with a taxonomy about various responses to religious diversity. And in general, you've got just absolutism, and on one extreme, the other extreme is relativism, right? Relativism is this notion that, hey, anything goes, all faiths are equally true. It's so open that it logically, frankly, it doesn't make sense. There's no basis for logic and reason, but it does respect their differences, but it says, well, they're all true. Religious absolutism, on the other hand, manifests itself in two ways: exclusivist and inclusivist. The exclusivist is an absolutist theology that says, hey, we've got the end all be all answer of things, and anybody who disagrees with us is wrong. And then inclusivism is sometimes, I think, mistaken for a more pluralistic kind of absolutism, but it's I think deeply problematic nonetheless. And some people have taken issue with the way that I've characterized this, but if you think of Karl Rayner's what I call his armchair evangelism, where you don't have to go out in the world and evangelize people, you just got to redefine what they think in terms of your values, and say that, well, really they're talking about the message of Christ, even though they don't mention them. Really, they're talking about stuff from the Holy Spirit, even though they don't mention it. And we can allow them to be, anonymous Christians, as it were. And that's really doing a injustice to understanding other faiths. It's a lazy way to understand other faiths without actually doing the work to say, what do they think from their perspective? What's their worldview? Instead of saying, I'm going to find value in you, but only insofar as you reflect what is important to me, right? And like that's what happens in a toxic relationship between human beings is that kind of stuff. And I think that's mirrored in theologies as well. But in the middle, we have a religious pluralism. And it gets, without getting into the weeds in this, I'm going to paint in some broad strokes here. You've got my iteration of the pluralistic theologies below, but I'm going to go to another very simple Venn diagram that I think really explains this nice and easy. So let me know when that shows.
It's up.
Is it showing? Doesn't show on my end, but okay. So here we have a Venn diagram also in chapter 1. You can see it's page 12. This is early on. So what do we mean by pluralism? Well, you've got the what I call identist and also what Griffin calls identist theologies, which is really things like John Hick, if you're familiar with his work. People mislabel it as a pluralism. It's not. It's an identist theology. But the idea is they abide by, basic laws of logic. They abide by things like the principle of non-contradiction. You can't have a worldview where God both exists and doesn't exist, right? So honoring the law of non-contradiction on the one hand. On the other side, you have the circle of relativist theologies, which, at least on the surface, they try to respect the differences between traditions. And there is some overlap there. There is a area of overlap where you both can respect the differences of other traditions and abide by the law of non-contradiction and still have a world that makes sense of, at least on the ontological level, on the metaphysical level, can make sense of ideas like God, that can make sense of ideas like Brahman, that can make sense of the Samkhya Yoga school and the Tao school, and these religious ultimates. So that's I'm gonna stop sharing. So that's a really brief intro to how I try to approach an understanding of what I mean by pluralism. In short, it's the radical idea that I don't know everything. It's the radical idea that while my tradition has value, I may be able to learn something from other traditions, right? And there's a vulnerability in that, where you open yourself up to the possibility of incompleteness, which frankly I think is a deeply spiritual journey that, or at least for myself, part of what the spiritual journey is trying to seek out completeness, and we can find that, I think, through other traditions. Now, what do I mean by ultimate when I say religious ultimates? I know this is through process and faith, so I imagine there's some familiarity with the audience with process philosophy and Whitehead and stuff. But he talks about how the world it's not just the ground of all being is something like just God alone, right? There's God, or what he calls deity, and there's creativity. And so creativity can match up with things like Brahman. So this ontological ultimate creativity can be used as a general scaffolding to make sense of Brahman or śūnyatā or Tao, these sorts of things. Deity obviously is like God. And then there's the actual occasions, because there's more than just two, there's more than just three ultimates for Whitehead's philosophy. And these can line up with things like animism. These can line up with other religious traditions that prioritize the multiplicity of ultimates in this world, as opposed to just the singular kind of Father God ultimate, or for Krishna lover ultimate, these sorts of things. So you have a narrative, a metaphysical narrative, that allows for it's a non-religious informed ontological narrative. And this is getting really complicated. I'm going to break it down in a minute. It's a non-religious ontological narrative on which you can hang multiple religious ultimates. This matters. This matters a great deal, because this is what's wrong with people's pluralistic theologies like Hick. So Hick genuinely wants to try to find a way to make room for the truth of other traditions, but he uses a Kantian metaphysics to do it. And this Western metaphysics that is used is, I think, deeply informed by the Christian tradition. And so it's in some ways a result of that worldview. And what you're doing still is trying to make non-Western traditions fit a Western mold. Whitehead's philosophy doesn't do that. it's such a new philosophy. He has to make new words for trying to make sense of things, right? Which is also, I think, one of the major hurdles, people still engaging his thought. I think that'll change over time. And one of the things I do in chapter 3 is I lay out a basic understanding of process theology. And one of the best compliments I got from the book on the book so far is that chapter 3 is one of the best presentations of process theology, a condensed presentation of process theology that a fellow scholar had seen. So that's some of the background. I want to pause actually for some questions from Sherry or Jared, because I'm in teaching, I'm used to call and response. I want to pause for a second and then get into some of the application of it.
Yeah, sure. I can just mention, so where you're talking about what you called a non-religious ontological narrative onto which you could hang different ultimates. One of the things, my own work is integrating Whitehead, but also Carl Jung. And so I kind of always have Jung in the other ear, whispering to me. And so I'm often talking about that all religion is metaphor, and that we can't get past, like Jung always said, there's no Archimedean point where we can get beyond consciousness, beyond the human psyche. And so in that sense, I think of ultimates, religious ultimates, all as different ways of different metaphors that we use to try to describe what I would call ultimate reality, which is different from religious ultimates in my mind. So there can be, to me, different religious ultimates that are all metaphors, because we can't ever get to the ultimate reality that may be behind all of those metaphors.
Thank you for that, because that animates me to talk about this next major point. And also, there's a difference there between your work and mine, because so one of the sections of my book is actually entitled "Taking Mystics Seriously," and I do take the position that no, these are actual references to actual religious ultimates, not just metaphors. But when the Sufi mystic, says that they experience God, that we take that seriously. When the Hindu mystic says they experience through yoga, kaivalya, or aloneness, that we take that seriously. We try to make sense of how they describe that religious ultimate, and say, can that description make sense with this one and this one, right? And so I have a whole section where we talk about that, and I'll dilute it with a joke. So I was looking for the page where it's in the book. I can't even remember where it is, but it's basically the description. One of the descriptions of metaphysics is looking for a black cat in a dark room, and the cat isn't there. Right? Skip maybe perhaps more of a Jungian perspective. It's like these are metaphors, and theology is looking for a black cat in a dark room that isn't there, and then finding it. But I try to take the perspective that no, we have to take these things quite seriously if we're going to have a genuine religious pluralism. And what is meant by the genuine is taking that. Go ahead.
Let me just insert just one quick comment there. I absolutely take mystical experience seriously. I just think that our words always fail us.
Got it.
So the experience is 100% real, and it's pointing to something that's 100% real, but the words fail us. The words are metaphorical.
Okay. No, thanks for that clarification. I misunderstood. So yeah, in that case, then perhaps we're more on the same page than I thought. But these are actual reference, God, śūnyatā, etc. So let's see. I'm going to go through a few highlights in the book. I spend a whole chapter on, from the South Asian perspective, looking at the Bhagavad Gita and looking at basically references on how the Hindu tradition makes sense of other traditions. So one of the verses that I look at, chapter 9, verse 23 of the Bhagavad Gita, goes something like this. That's Krishna talking. And if you're not familiar with the Gita, it's this crazy story where God comes down to earth in the form of man and then talks to us and tells us about, how the right way to live is, kind of like Jesus. So in chapter 9, verse 23, he says, though others worship me um, either in the wrong way or in different ways, and they basically don't recognize me as God, and they worship me by different names, I still accept their worshipfulness. And it is an efficacious way of worshiping. Now, this is markedly in contrast, say, to something like Exodus in the Torah and Old Testament, where they say, "Thou shalt put no other god before me," or "I'm a jealous God and do not worship other deities." Right, in general, it's moves like this from the South Asian tradition that a lot of people say, "Oh, this is a very pluralistic tradition. It's maybe much more open to others." And what I argue in that chapter is that it's not. Um, what they're actually doing in their tradition is not quite different from what Western religious traditions and theologians have done, and looking at other traditions to say we can make sense of them insofar as we can reduce them to the values of our own tradition. And they do that just like Western theologians do in passages like this. So there's the story in the Buddhist tradition of I'm sorry, strike that. From the Vishnu tradition about the Buddhist tradition. So the Vaishnavites, the worshippers of Vishnu, talk about Vishnu having 10 forms. And he's been to Earth many times before, and he's done different things in Earth. And one of the times he came as the Buddha. And Vishnu came to Earth as the Buddha for a specific reason. The gods, the devas, were having a difficult time defeating the demons, the rakshas and the yakshas, and they couldn't defeat them because they had adopted the truths of the Vedas. And the Vedas provided basically an adamantine armor for them that they were indefeatable. And so they had to come up with a way to lure the demons away from the truth and the protections of the Vedas. So God manifested himself as the Buddha to come and teach the wrong thing on purpose and make it very seductive and very convincing. So convincing, in fact, that people would leave the Vedas to follow the Buddha and therefore be able to be defeated by the Devas. Now, that's a neat story. This is how that tradition makes sense of Buddhism. And at the time when this story was created, they were going through quite an upheaval in South Asia, where lots of people were leaving the South Asian Brahmanical tradition in favor of the Buddhist tradition. And they had to come up with an explanation for that. And this is one of the ways that they did that. So they, in an inclusivist way, incorporate the entire Buddhist tradition in their narrative. Now, if you ask a Buddhist what they think about that story, you can imagine their reaction will be that that's laughable and they dismiss it. And of course, that's false, right? And that's what happens when you have inclusivism. While it may actually lead to, not that there was, I'm sure there was, less religious violence between those two groups because one has an inclusivist understanding of the other, saying, oh, no, they have value. That's actually God. He taught them some good things, don't kill animals and stuff like that. But it was a trick of God. But at the end of the day, they do a theological violence to that tradition by not taking them seriously in their own terms. So I explore things like that in that chapter, as well as some back and forth articles that I'd published with Jeffrey Long, who is a process thinker from the South Asian tradition as well. And he's actually featured in that book, Religious Pluralism. From there, I move on to a chapter that I published a version of this in a book on interreligious dialogue, and it's actually gotten quite a lot of interest. And really, it was the first English philosophical critique of Pope Benedict XVI's theology, or Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger. Of course, these writings were before he was the Pope. Some people thought it was inappropriate to challenge the Pope's philosophy, but even as a Catholic, he's still a thinker. He's a philosopher of religion, and so I interrogate his, I think, deep misunderstanding of religious pluralism, because he really conflates pluralism and relativism as the same thing, and that's a deep misunderstanding of those. So I explore that, as well as the purpose of dialogue and how. I'll read a little bit. By simply engaging in dialogue, one admits gaps. And so it's about how we can be vulnerable with our own tradition and still honor its truth, while making room to understand without embracing the other, right? It's not a call for conversion to new religion we call pluralism, or to the other person's religion, but to what I like to call understanding without embracing. I conclude with an admonition to my fellow philosophers and theologians that we need more comparative philosophy. We need more comparative theology, because so much of what's been done in the last 100, 200 years in philosophy of religion is really just Christian philosophy. It's important. It's been vital, I think, but it's been so focused on the Abrahamic traditions. I should include it, not just Christian philosophy, but Judaic, Abrahamic, Islamic, Christian philosophy. But it's been so focused on that tradition that it has failed to consider many of the deep questions of epistemology and metaphysics from non-Western traditions. And we need to encourage more language understanding of classical Chinese, Sanskrit, and the like, to have the ability to have the authority to have deep, meaningful discussions about ultimate reality from various religious perspectives. Because, I mean, if we take seriously about God's interaction with this world, it ain't just about us Westerners, right? And we need to be curious enough and honor that mystery enough to learn about the others from their perspectives, so we can come back and say, yeah, I think we've got a good understanding, or wow, I really got that wrong, and I've grow from that experience. So I don't know how long I talked, but I really wanted to talk in really general terms about it, and I want to hear what your thoughts, curiosities are, and then from there I can get into the weeds more. I do want to make a shameless plug, if I may. I've really been honored. Going to have a panel on this book at Thomas J. Ward has a conference coming up in February. It's a virtual online conference. February 22nd, there's a panel of 5 scholars on my book in particular. People like Jay McDaniel with your group. Doral Hayes is a doctoral student from the UK. Vince Brackett is a pastor. And Tyler McNabb, who's doing a book review in an evangelical journal of philosophy. So I'm really stoked to have that opportunity to engage with scholars at that conference, and I'll share it in the side views there. I'll also share a link to the book with a 30% coupon. There's an e-version and the paper. I don't know why the publisher charges how much they do. I feel a little shame about what they charge for that. I don't see that. But the ebook's affordable with the coupon, and I'll share that with you. But I'll stop talking for a minute or two.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Matthew. That was really good. One quick thing I'd like to ask, that we can maybe, if you could share an example. I a while back had read and really loved the book Without the Buddha, I Couldn't Be a Christian by Paul Knitter.
Mm.
And so I'm just wondering if, in your own experience, is there anything that in all of your study of different traditions that's opened up something in your own upbringing in Catholicism, or have you moved, like, is there anything that linked you back to that tradition in a new way, or is there something else that led you to embrace a new tradition, like, sort of in your own experience of working with these narratives? How have what kind of changes, because if the point is to let's all learn something, maybe if you could give an example of something that opened up for you in
Sure.
a new way.
Well, and this is before I did the book. This was in 2003. I had the honor of living and teaching in India. I lived in a Buddhist monastery there, and I taught Buddhist philosophy. And I took refuge with the Buddha, and that's lingo for converting, in a sense. So I I consider myself, if I had to identify with a religious tradition, I would say I'm both Buddhist and Catholic, which, if you're educated in either of those traditions, you might rightly say that doesn't make any sense. And part of what this project of religious pluralism does through the process theology is it allows that worldview to make sense. Because in the Buddhist tradition, they're atheists. They're unabashed atheists, and for good reason. The way they talk about no self, and um, though they both traditions talk of love and compassion, though I think with different emphases, there's some overlap in the real world application of compassion and caring for others, but the metaphysics doesn't match up. And so it has really been, like Nietzsche said, all philosophy is biography. That's very much the case for me here. Um, be the short answer to that. Um, there is one other figure. I guess I'll share it real quick. This is dated, but um, where did it go? This is another motivating thing for me, is because I know I'm not alone. Let me know when that changes. Um,
Yep, we can see it.
is it scrolled down to the
I can see the top part of that under the Americans are not. Yeah, there you go.
there? Is that there now? Okay.
Yep.
So Americans are not dogmatic about religion. So you can look at that on your own, screenshot that, come back to it. It's from 2007, so it's a bit dated. But frankly, I think these numbers have continued to go in this progressive, pluralistic direction. So many people identify as spiritual but not religious. Increasingly, numbers of people say they don't go to church, but they believe in God. And it's not to turn off away from maybe the politics from the pew, but it is, I think, a dissatisfaction with the traditional theologies. And what I strongly believe this kind of my book does, and others who um, advocate for religious pluralism, is that it allows for the average believer to stand up to those religious authorities that tell them you can't be a cafeteria Catholic, or tell them, they talk down to him and they say, you have these thoughts that you think are meaningful, but they really are empty and make no sense, and it's relativism, like what Ratzinger does. And it provides a robust narrative, a robust metaphysical narrative with a systematic philosophy, Whitehead's, that can stand up to the rigors of philosophical investigation, make sense, and be able to say, no, my faith makes sense in terms of this, but now so do those ones too. And so while it can be a little technical at times to get to that, that's what I see as the, frankly, public service role of philosophers and theologians is. Like, it's applied theology in a way. It's applied metaphysics in a way. It lets you, the rubber meet the road for ontology in a way that I think philosophy has been lacking for quite a while. And we as philosophers and theologians need to get back to that. We need to stop just talking to ourselves and try to find ways to make the work that we do in philosophy give meaning to people's everyday lives. And that's my highest aspiration that I hope I'm able to accomplish in even just some small way.